Today we will briefly talk about these simulation methods. Yesterday we talked about these dark matter simulations and various predictions from these uniform volumes, also from zoom-in simulations to understand the large-scale structure of dark matter and the small-scale structure down to the velocity distribution in halos and making also predictions for direct and indirect detection. And today, we try to scratch the surface of how these codes actually work. And as I said on Friday, we will run some of these simulations on your laptops. I will try to put the software and the tar file on the website tonight, and this will also include some instructions how to install this. So if you have some time tomorrow or on Thursday to install the software, that would be very helpful, because then we don't have to struggle so much on Friday. So the main issue there is that you need to have essentially a couple of libraries installed. It's the GSL library, HDF5, FFTW, and the MPI library. So these are the 4 libraries. So if you have those already installed, then everything should actually be working. If not, if you have a Linux machine or Apple machine, it should actually be pretty easy. I don't know too much about Microsoft, but should probably also be some way to do this. Okay, so let's then start with the simulation methods. So yesterday, we said that if we have a canonical dark matter particle, then the number of dark matter particles in a Milky Way halo is just enormous. So if you assume 100 GeV particle, then hopefully I did the math here right, then the number of individual dark matter particles is of the order of 10 to the 70 roughly, or 67 or so. So it's just an enormous number. So we cannot simulate each individual particle. It's just impossible, and it will be impossible essentially forever. So that is not going to work. And given that you have this large amount of particles, each particle essentially moves within a collective potential. So there's no two-body scattering happening between them. It's just that all the particles make up a collective potential, and then the individual particle moves through this sea of other particles, essentially. And that means that if you take a distribution function in phase space, which depends on the position and the velocity on time, then this distribution function has to obey the Vlasov equation, or the collisionist-Boltzmann equation. So this is essentially this equation that the total derivative of the phase space density is just conserved. So this is similar to Liouville's theorem, just a statement that the phase space density, here this total derivative doesn't change because of the collisionist character of the system. Now if you break this down in these partial derivatives, you see that this is the equation you want to solve. You also see this potential here. The potential is self-consistently generated by all the particles. So this equation has to be coupled to the Poisson equation, which gives you the potential. So at the end of the day, you have to solve this Poisson-Vlasov equation to actually evolve the dark matter distribution. So if you want to do dark matter simulations, the only thing you have to do is literally solve this set of equations. And if you look at it, it doesn't look too complicated, because this is just a PDE. And as you know, we have a lot of knowledge how to solve PDEs in math, and this is just some Poisson equation. So presumably with some Green's function or so, you should also be able to solve this. So that doesn't look so difficult. Now, if you think about a PDE or how you solve PDEs, what you essentially do, you discretize every dimension of your function. Your function depends on a couple of variables, and you discretize all these variables, and then you solve the function on this discretized mesh, or whatever you want to call it. So in this case, we have to discretize in x, in v, and in time, in principle. So x is a 3-dimensional vector, v is a 3-dimensional vector, and the time is just 1-dimensional. So that is what we have to do to solve this equation. So this is summarized here now again. We have to solve this, this PDE. And once you solve the PDE, you can also get the configuration space or real space density by just integrating out the velocities. So this gives you all the information. It gives you the velocity distribution, velocity dispersions, everything you want. Once you have the phase space density, you have full control over the system. You know everything. So again, this is what you want to solve. Now, if you think about the PDE and how we want to solve this PDE, then we have to count first the independent variables. So we had 3 coordinates, 3 velocities, and 1 time. So that's 7 independent variables, and then we can put this onto a fine grid on the computer. So in the grid should be fine enough to resolve some interesting structures within a halo. So for example, if we have a halo which has a radius, a very radius of the order of 200 kiloparsec, which is typical for the Milky Way, as we said yesterday, and we have a velocity dispersion in this halos of the order of 200 kilometers per second. That's also the typical value what you have in Milky Way halos, for example. And if you want to resolve the velocity structure and the spatial scales with 1 kilometer per second and 1 kiloparsec, I just made these numbers up because that is what, that's a reasonable resolution that we want to achieve. Then you would need, if you figure out the math, you would need of the order of 64 trillion grid cells. So that's the number you need. And then on this grid, you have to store, of course, some information, because in phase space, for every grid cell, you have to store in the cell at least the mass that's in the cell or the number of dark matter particles that's in the cell. Because that's what the phase space density describes. It describes at a given point in phase space the number density or the mass density of the system. And so you have to store one number, essentially, per grid cell. Now, if you try to be if you want to try to save memory, you don't store this in a double, but you store this with a float, which means you need 4 bytes to store this per grid cell. Now, if you work out the memory to store this whole thing, then you need 0.25 petabyte. However, if you really want to go below a kiloparsec, as you've seen yesterday, the simulation that was done in 2008, we had already a spatial resolution of 50 parsec or so. So if you want to go below that, you easily have to scale this up to something like 2 petabyte. Now, if you look at supercomputers that are available today or a year ago or so, or it's just a typical number, then you will see that most supercomputers have of the order of 2 gigabyte per core. Some have a bit more, some have even a bit less. So that means you need at least 1 million processors to do the simulation. Otherwise, you will not be able to fit in the memory. And that's a pure memory requirement. That's not a CPU time requirement, it's pure memory. So in many of these applications, the main challenge is not so much running the simulation in terms of the computing time, but also fitting it onto the machine, because the memory requirement is very large. And don't forget, this is dark matter only, so we don't even talk about gas or stars, and which becomes then even more memory intensive, as we will see on Thursday. Yeah, so you need of the order of 1 million processors. Now, if you look at the fastest computers and the biggest machines that we have, this is a bit outdated, but it didn't change too dramatically. This is from June 2017. The top 10 machines that are around, and you see this 2 Chinese machines. I would still think that they are the top machines. I'm not 100% sure, but you can see here the number of cores. So this is something like 10 million, 3 million, and then it quickly goes into the 100,000s here. So it's not that we have a ton of machines that actually can fit 1 million cores or even more if we want to go beyond that. And don't forget, the calculation we just made is just for a single halo. We don't even talk about the uniform volume where we can resolve multiple halos, because the simulations I showed you before with this large dynamic range, they resolve tens of thousands of halos. So this is, yeah.
So this isn't my area, so I'm sorry if this isn't a good question. But so limiting our ability to put in like hadrons and gas and matter and all that, is it more the computing power or more the theory as far as acting?
So the question is, if you go beyond dark matter and want to put also in the gas and so on, what the main limitation is. So it's on the one hand the computing power, which is because these simulations become significantly more expensive. On the other hand, modeling the gas and all the star formation in these processes is also much more uncertain than the dark matter. So the dark matter at the end of the day, because it's a collisionless system, you have a single equation that you have to solve, which is the collision response bond equation, coupled to the Poisson equation. And that's a well-defined mathematical problem. But if you have stars and all these other things, then the main problem is, again, as we will see on Thursday, that the formation of a star, for example, happens on so small scales that in all of these simulations, even the best simulations today, we cannot resolve the formation of an individual star in these large-scale galaxy formation simulations. So what we have to do is we have to come up with effective models how star formation and black holes and everything is modeled. And there's a lot of uncertainties in these effective models, how you write them down and put them in the simulation codes. So what do you mean by a magical computer?
If we suddenly had this huge computational jump and we could put anything in and weren't worried about parameters.
Yes, I agree. So even if we had if you had much better computing power, it's still that the actual theory of star formation, for example, or the black hole physics is still not 100% understood, right? So there are a lot of uncertainties even there. So it's much more challenging to model these processes than simulating the dark matter, where we know that there's just one equation that we have to solve. And we know the initial conditions very precisely also. Okay, so if you look at this, the question then becomes, how can we make any progress at all if even this simple calculation with a single halo is so expensive and doesn't seem to be feasible? Well, you have to do some tricks. Before I talk about the tricks, I just want to mention that there are some papers or some people who try to really solve, this Poisson-Vlasov equation directly. Yeah? And what you can see here is that the largest simulation, I mean, this is a bit old, it's from 2012, it's also a very nice paper, but back then the largest simulation they were able to run is a 64 to the power of 6 grid. So it's just 64 grid cells per dimension, which is, you don't resolve much with that. It's just not a huge dynamic range. But that was the best they could do back then. And it's just super expensive to do this if you solve the equations like that. Yeah, so you have to do something different if you really want to make some progress. And what you have to realize is that one can actually use a Monte Carlo approach. So the basic idea is that especially cold dark matter has a very specific structure in phase space. So if you take a two-dimensional phase space, just to simplify the situation, where you here have the position and here you have the velocity, then dark matter is not filling the full phase space, at least cold dark matter. So the reason for that is that a neutralino and an axion, at the time when they, when structure formation essentially starts, they have already a tiny velocity dispersion. So they follow very closely this dashed line, which is kind of the Hubble flow. So there are only very small velocity perturbations around the Hubble flow because it's a very cold species. And what you see then, if you would discretize this whole space, you would just waste a lot of computing time with discretizing empty space because dark matter is just not here. So it's just very inefficient to discretize everything. And what you can also see here is that structure formation in cold dark matter, if you look at the phase space, works in a very interesting way because actually if a halo forms, you get this winding up of the phase space sheet. Yeah, so if you have gravity acting here, this phase space sheet will keep up winding and the halo will slowly form. And what you can see here is that at a given position, for example, here you will get 3 distinct velocities. And the reason why we get a continuous velocity distribution or nearly continuous velocity distribution like these Gaussian or close to Maxwellians that I showed yesterday is that at some point these number of velocity streams becomes very large. So of the order of hundreds of thousands of millions, and then this approximates the velocity distribution that we saw yesterday. But on the smallest fine scale or fine-grained level, the structure formation actually looks like this. Yeah, so I know this looks a bit strange, maybe to some of you, but that's literally what's happening in CDM, how a halo forms. And it has also direct implication for all kind of detection experiments, because if you go, for example, if you approach the halo, so this would be kind of the outer boundary of the halo, if you approach it here from the right, at that point here, if you project down the density on the x-axis, it would be extremely large because the velocity dispersion is so small. So in fact, if this sheet here were a delta function, the density would be infinite. It's only regularized by the finite velocity dispersion of the neutralino or the axion or whatever your dark matter particle is. And that means if you look for the annihilation signal, for example, you can get a huge boost because of these effects, what is also known as caustics. And so you get these caustic effects, which can in principle have a large effect. And I will talk a bit more about this later today. Does everybody get this basic idea? I know this picture of the formation of a halo is a bit strange, but that's what's actually happening on the small scales.
Is this a trajectory for one dark matter particle?
No, there are dark matter particle sittings all along the sheet here, essentially. Yeah. So dark matter particles also stream in here. They stream in and then it's winding up, essentially. The point is, because of the collisionist Boltzmann equation, this phase space sheet, and also because of the Liouville theorem, it can have a tear. You just keep winding it up, essentially.
Yeah, but it is kind of time dependent?
Yeah, it's a time-dependent curve. Yeah, it will evolve with time. It's just for one instant in time here. Yeah. Yeah. No, that is not special. That's just a number I picked when I was drawing it, or the paper where I got this from. So this will go up, right? Initially, if once structure formation starts, everything will be extremely close to the Hubble flow. It will just be a single stream region. And then through gravity, it will wind up. And again, it has two implications for direct detection. It has one, these caustics, which might be important for indirect detection. And if you're interested in axion detection, if we had a very low number of streams here at the local position, then a low number of streams would pass through the axion detector. And then for each stream, you would get a line in your resonant cavity, yeah, for a given frequency, which corresponds to the velocity of the particles. So it makes a huge difference whether you have 100 streams at this position in the galaxy or whether you have 1,000,000 streams. Because if you have 1,000,000, then it strongly depends what your energy resolution is of your axion detector, whether you can resolve these individual streams. So there are some people arguing that there should be here at this position a very low number of streams, and then you would expect very significant peaks in the axion spectrum. Well, this caustic position, I mean, in general, they are not stable with time, the position of the caustics. But if you take, for example, a one-dimensional spherical system, you can actually derive some similarity solution. Then you can see that the caustics, with respect to the what's known as the turnaround radius, they are at a certain fraction of the radius. So then they are at a specific radius. But in a general three-dimensional non-symmetric system, they would just be spread out and also move with time, essentially, a bit around. Yeah. Okay, good. So that is the picture for CDM, and we want to solve CDM. So what we do now is we introduce these simulation particles, which are these heavy macroscopic dark matter particles, much more heavy than the actual neutralino, so typically of the order of 10 to the 4, 10 to the 3, or 10 to the 5 solar masses. And we throw them in the simulation, and then we let them follow just essentially the equations of motion, with this self-consistent potential, which is generated by all the pairwise interactions. And then this distribution of particles is a macroscopic sampling of the underlying phase-space distribution. And you will approach the exact phase-space distribution if this limit n goes to infinity. So what we do not solve the Vlasov equation, but instead we solve this system of equations for a given number n of simulation particles. Yeah. And you also see here this epsilon, and which we discussed already yesterday, that's the softening parameter, which we have to introduce because this n is much smaller than the number of real neutralinos. So typically it's of the order of 1 billion if you simulate a Milky Way halo. It's not much larger. So that is, 60 or 70, well, 60, slightly less than 60 orders of magnitude below what we would actually need. So we have to soften this to recover the collisionist character of the system. Because if we do not soften here the pairwise interaction, then we get these large angle particle scatterings, and we don't mimic then the collisionist system. Yeah, so this epsilon is always required to mimic the collisionist system, because the underlying physics is the Vlasov equation, and this is the collisionist Boltzmann equation. So it has to be modeled as a collisionist fluid, and the only way to do this is by introducing this softening scale. And we discussed this already yesterday when we remember this table that we had for the simulation where there were these different epsilon values. So this is exactly that epsilon value here that was always quoted in the table. Yeah, so we reduced essentially the problem to solving that equation. And if you see what that actually is, this is a typical n-body problem, a gravitational n-body problem. That means you have n bodies that only interact gravitationally, and you have to figure out their dynamics. That, that is still difficult to some degree because, if n is larger than 2, essentially, you have to do this numerically. So we have to figure this out somehow also numerically, but as you will see, it's easier than solving the full collisionist Boltzmann equation. Sorry? Exactly, that's exactly the problem. Yeah, we come to that in a second. It's an n-square problem, and that's still a limitation because every particle has to interact with every other particle. So it's literally an n-square problem, which is a very bad complexity if you want to go for very large n. Anyways, so that is what we want to do, and ideally we also want to have small particle masses to get better resolution. we want to have large volumes, and at the end of the day, it always asks for more particles to do better simulations. So the more particles you have, the better you sample the phase space distribution. Yeah, it's a pure number of a pure function of particle number. If you have 10 times more particles, you will resolve smaller scales and smaller masses with this simulation. It's just a pure function of the particle number. And so the main challenge then is how to calculate these gravitational forces. That's the main remaining challenge. And as we just heard, if you do this with the so-called direct summation, if you just literally evaluate this thing, then you quickly realize that this is an n-square problem. Because this red one here has to interact with all the others, and similarly for all the others here, so it's always n-square. And that's really very bad scaling. Because that means if you increase your numerical resolution by a factor of 10, it becomes 100 times slower, essentially, or 100 times more expensive. And that's not very good. So this is typically complexity of O(n) square, because you need these n-square summations per time step in the simulation. So how do we get rid of that? Well, there are different ways of doing this. The first thing that you can think of is using something which is more efficient than n square and can also help you to solve gravitational problems. And the first thing you might think of is doing FFT, because the FFT is much more efficient than n square. So what you can do is you can actually put a mesh on your simulation volume and solve the Poisson equation. The Poisson equation gives you the potential, and from the potential, through finite differencing, you can get the forces. And then you have the gravitational forces. You've advanced the particles according to these forces and according to your time step, and then you are done. Yeah, so this is this typical idea. You can derive the potential essentially through a Green's function, and the Green's function you can very easily get in Fourier space, because it's just a here product, the potential between the Green's function and the density. So it's very easy to calculate this with the FFT. And then the only thing you have to do is, essentially these are the steps for these particle mesh algorithms. You do a density assignment, so you put the particles on the grid cells. You compute the potential field, and then you do a finite differencing to compute the force field, and then you assign the forces from the grid back to the particles in some way. And then you have the forces, the gravitational forces, acting on all the particles in the simulation volume with something which is scaled as n log n, which is much more efficient than n square, and you can then advance this whole thing in this particle mesh based way. Yeah, so this is a standard way of doing it, and that is extremely efficient. And it mainly relies on the efficiency with which we can do a FFT. Well, just some more details. As I mentioned, the finite differencing is simply a step where you know, the force is just the gradient of the potential, and there are different ways of doing the finite differencing then, whether you want to have a second or third order algorithm, the spatial order of the scheme. So you can write down different ways of doing that. That gives you the force then on the grid, and then from the force, you can then, with some interpolation function, you can then take the force on the grid with the interpolation function and interpolate the forces on the particle position. So don't forget, the particles don't sit at the grid centers. The grid is just the overall grid, and the particles can move around as they wish. So we always have to take the forces and interpolate them back onto the particles. And so there's a first step where we have all the particles. We assign the densities to the grid cells. Then we do all our FFT stuff. That gives us the potential. Then we do a finite differencing. And then we take the forces and interpolate back onto the particles. Then we have all the particle forces. And then we can advance the system, because that gives us the accelerations. Yeah? Does this make sense? Okay. So the problem with this is, if you have a grid like this, you're essentially limited in your dynamic range, because all of a sudden, if you have only a grid, then you're again limited by the maximum FFT you can do. Because the FFT gives you the force resolution at the end of the day. And as you might know, doing huge FFTs can also be quite memory intensive and also quite time consuming. So if you want to do a FFT of 8,000 cube, FFT is already extremely expensive. Yeah, so it's not possible to put a grid fine enough onto the simulation domain to really resolve the small scales. So what you instead do is you say, well, on the large scales, where I have to calculate the forces, I use the FFT, and on the small scales, I can, for a subset of the particles, which is within the vicinity of a given particle, we can use direct summation. So then we combine the direct summation with the particle mesh method. And that's called particle-particle PM method or P-cube method, because it's a particle-particle interaction on the small scales, and on the large scales you do a particle mesh interaction. And then you combine essentially the advantage of the direct summation, which is local adaptivity, with the efficiency on large scales of the FFT. So this will still scale here like n squared, but it's only a subset of all the particles. It's not all the particles, so it's not too bad. And on large scales, you still profit or benefit from the scaling of the FFT. So this has been also a quite common method, and some people are still using this. It's more efficient. Now there's a problem also with this, because, so these are the advantages. If you have a halo, for example, forming here, then a lot of particles can go into this small region, and then the n can still become quite large. So at some point, especially if you go into the very nonlinear regime towards lower redshifts, it can still become rather slow, because at some point this n square scaling might take over. I mean, it depends a bit on the simulation, but it can become slow, because at some point you run into n square scaling. If you have a cluster or a galaxy halo or a cluster forming, at some point you have a lot of particles there. And for all of those, since they are nearby, you have to do the direct summation. Then you run into this n square bottleneck, and the whole simulation again becomes very slow. So we have to do something about this direct summation part, so we have to speed this up. So that's the last thing that needs to be speed up, and then we should be fine. So there are various ways of doing this. So one way is to get rid of the direct summation and instead do something called a mesh refinement. So we have the large mesh here, and then we adaptively refine the mesh. So we take a large grid cell and put just smaller grid cells inside it. And we always do this depending on the local dark matter density in these cells. So that gives us adaptive increase in resolution, still at a reasonable cost for the computation. So this is a typical mesh refinement scheme, and you have to plug in some refinement criteria where you want to refine, but that's more efficient essentially than the direct summation coupled to the particle mesh. Because here you again have to solve everything on a grid, and that can be done efficiently. Another way of doing this is, and this is an extremely popular way, and all the simulations I showed so far, and also all the simulations that I'm going to show will essentially use that, is using a tree algorithm. So who has ever heard of a tree algorithm? Anybody? So who knows what an octree is, or a KDE tree? Binary tree. Okay. So trees are very efficient for various tasks. I mean, sometimes for sorting, but here we will use it essentially to speed up the calculation of the gravity force. Yeah, and that is then called, we will couple the tree to the particle mesh, and that's then called tree PM, and that's essentially the standard scheme of most of the simulation codes today. So these Millennium simulations that I showed, this AQ or Aquarius simulations that I showed yesterday, they all use this tree PM scheme. So that's one of the most efficient schemes currently around. Yeah. So how does that work? Well, we just said that if we do pure particle-particle calculations in this P-cube M method, we suffer from this pure n square scaling. Because each particle has to still calculate the pairwise force with n other neighbors, so if there's a lot of clustering, it becomes slow. So the question is there a more efficient way to do this particle-particle calculation? And the idea is the following of this tree algorithm is that you have your particle here that wants to calculate the gravitational interaction with all the other particles here. So if this set of particles is far away from this red particle, then it's actually sufficient to take this mass distribution and, for example, take the monopole of this mass distribution and let only the monopole, or potentially even some higher orders, interact with that particle. So you don't have to evaluate all individual force contributions, so these gray lines. You only have to evaluate one force contribution, which is the black line, which is the monopole. So the only thing you need is a criterion for the distance, how far a particle group can be away, so that you can really do this. Of course, if the particle group becomes very close to the red particle, then taking the monopole only is just a very bad approximation. But the further away the particles are, and as you can imagine, if you have a 100 megaparsec volume, there will be a lot of particles far away from the particle, then this is very efficient. So the basic idea of this tree algorithm is essentially that you group together a bunch of particles and let them interact, or let their monopole interact with the actual particle that wants to calculate the force. Yeah. So that's the basic idea of the tree. So how do you do this? Well, this is a two-dimensional example here. So you have a two-dimensional simulation domain. It's not three-dimensional. So you have your particles sitting at these positions, and then you subdivide with a tree until you have in each leaf of the tree only one particle. And now if you want to calculate the force of this particle with some other particles, then depending on how far away the particles are, it's sufficient to don't walk the tree all the way down to the leaf, but stop at some point here and just take the monopole moment of this tree cell here. Yeah, and then you don't have to walk it down and have to calculate all the individual interactions, but only with the monopole moment of one tree. So you walk the branches of the tree, but you cut off at some point if it's sufficient to take only the monopole. Of course, for particles that are very nearby, you always have to walk the tree all the way down to calculate all the local forces. Yeah, so that's the basic idea. And the tree that's typically used for many simulations is just the octree, which means you divide your simulation volume in 3 dimensions, at least in the first level in 8 subvolumes, and then each subvolume again in 8 subvolumes. This is why it's called octree. It's a standard octree. Yeah. Third step. So this one?
Yeah, this one, the square above.
Yeah, I think it's just to make things more, it gets too busy on the right, I think, if you include everything here. Yeah, yeah, it's just showing one branch, probably. Yeah. Okay, and what you can show is, if you figure out the complexity of that algorithm, you can show that it's not n square anymore, but it's n log n. So then this means if you replace the direct summation with that algorithm, you get n log n on small scales, and you get n log n through the FFT on large scales. So then you have a scheme, if you combine the tree with the particle mesh to the tree PM, that scales just as n log n. And that's a very good scaling. Yeah, so that is typically considered very efficient. So that means if you increase the particle number by 10, it doesn't become 100 times more expensive. It's only n log n. And again, this is what many simulations use. Yep. Yep.
So if you want to compare, we find force between a leaf and another leaf, we find
Mhm.
so walking the tree would be going back to the nearest common ancestor and
Yes.
down and stop walking at some point.
Yeah, you have a certain criterion which tells you where you don't have to walk the tree any further, and that is dependent on how far the particle is essentially away. So if you walk the tree for a set of particles, and this group of particles is far away, then there's a criterion which tells you, okay, you don't have to walk further because that group is so far away, so just take the monopole moment of that particle distribution, and it's fine. So there's one free number essentially in this tree algorithm, but it's very well tested and very well understood to which values you can set this number. So there's it's not arbitrary. So the people have a good handle on that and tested this a lot. Okay. So the only remaining thing is we have to combine now this tree algorithm with the particle mesh method. And what we will do to this end, we will essentially split the potential of a single particles in Fourier space into a long and a short range part. Short range part we use the tree, and the long range part we use the particle mesh or the FFT. Yeah? So as it is written here. And if you want to do this, you essentially end up with these equations. So this is now the potential here that we want to solve for, and then you have a short-range contribution and a long-range contribution, and you can see there's a certain radius RS, which is exponentially suppressing things here. That's the cut radius here. So you have a certain radius that you put into the problem, at which point, or within which you calculate the short-range forces with the tree, and beyond that, typically, because this exponential suppression here, you calculate the long-range forces with the particle mesh method. Yeah, so if you want to, so there's this typical split in short and long range. And the PM works as before. We do the mass assignment, the FFT forward, we multiply with the Green's function, the FFT backward, do finite differencing, and then we interpolate the forces, exactly as we said before. And this thing here, we do in real space, essentially. So we FFT this equation, then we solve this in real space with the tree, just with a modified potential, which has this complementary error function, which comes because of this exponential cutoff here. So if you FFT this, you get a complementary error function, and then you solve this potential on short ranges with the tree, and then you add it together with the force that you get on the long range, and then you get the full force of the particle split in long range and short range. And that's very efficient. It scales as n log n. Because this here, the tree is n log n, and the particle mesh is n log n. And that's more or less the most efficient you can do these days. Okay, so this is yet again a summary how this works. So you have your particle, and then you have this radius within which you calculate the short range force, and then the blue region you calculate the particle mesh force. Yeah, and you can of course this RS you can play with this, but again this is pretty well tested to which values this you have to set this compared to the grid size. So there were a lot of studies. So most simulators actually know to what values to set this to get reasonable force accuracy. And as I said, this 3PM scheme was used for essentially most of the state-of-the-art simulations, like all these Millennium simulations, the query simulation, Phoenix, which is a cluster simulation, Illustris and Illustris TNG, which we will discuss on Thursday, are hydrodynamic simulations. Eagle is also a hydrodynamic simulation. Fire are also hydrodynamic simulation. So all of these use this scheme, essentially. And if you look at it, how precise that is, you can make, for example, this plot, which shows as a function of radius the force, and the dashed line is the exact force. Is the force that you get if you sum up the short range and the long range, and you can see the short range drops here because the short range force, the long range kicks in here, and then you recover, or you get this dashed line. So it's very precise actually if you do this.
Isn't it dangerous to that you might get artifacts? I mean, from this special point.
Well, it's a special point, but since you do it, you don't really get artifacts because it's not one special point in the domain, because it's overlapping with all the particles, right? So you have one particle has its neighborhood, another particle has its neighborhood, so it's not imprinted in the simulation domain anywhere. Yeah. It's all okay. Yeah. Yeah.
How far you walk before you stop walking? Does that depend on the cap on computing power? Because you want to make sure that error falls with
Yeah, so typically, all this depends a bit on what force accuracy you want to achieve. So if you want to have perfect force accuracy, so no errors in the force accuracy, then the FFT is of course exact, and then it all depends on where you cut with the tree and how exact you do the tree. So if you want to have an exact force with the tree, you would need to walk the tree always to all the leaves. But then if you do this, then the n log n complexity goes again to n square. So then you lose all the advantages. So what's typically done is that in these large-scale simulations, we are good to live with a force error of the order of 5 or 10%, because we just simulate this collective large ensemble of particles. So the individual orbit of an individual macroscopic dark matter particle is never perfectly integrated in these simulations. It's just in an average sense, they follow the right trajectories, but the whole integration scheme and also the force accuracy typically have errors of the order of 5, or the forces have errors of the order of 5 or 10%, and we can live with that. You can, of course, all test this. You can change the force accuracy and convince yourself that things don't change, and people have done this a lot. And so if you have 5 or 10%, it's typically good. Yeah. Because if you really make it very exact again, you go again into n square. Yeah.
Maybe you answered this. So Tillman is worried. Presumably you move the mapping point back and forth in the simulation to make sure that nothing happens.
Yeah, that is what. Yeah, this is especially if we do zoom-in simulations. So people during the testing, essentially, they play with this RS parameter to see that things are not sensitive to it. And for most of there's a huge testing. Yeah. There's a lot of experience required for these simulations. It's not really like a recipe that you have to follow, right? So people have tried a lot also to figure out the optimal choice for the softening length and all this. There is no exact equation that tells you this is the exact right softening length. This is the exact right value where you cut your short range force and so on and so forth. It's based a lot on testing. Yes. Yeah. You can write down an efficiency curve and you go to the minimum essentially. Yeah.
the error in the force the error in the force will have a bearing on the error in the resolution we're trying to achieve. So if we try to go for
No, because you typically, if you increase the resolution, you keep the setup of the forces the same, because the system, if you increase the number of particles, is itself adaptive. So well, let me restate this. So if you increase the number of particles, you typically also increase the number of mesh cells. So this RS is typically expressed in units of mesh cells. So if it's 5 RS or whatever you put there, it also gets smaller. So you increase the number of particles, and you typically also then, if you increase, for example, the number of particles by 8, you typically increase the number of cells per dimension by 2. Yeah. So and then this is all self-consistently tracking each other without adopting anything else there. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good question, actually. Maybe I can give this question back. So we don't use a super accurate integrator because we just want to follow the average phase space evolution, but there's one property that's very important about the integrator. Can somebody guess what that is? Yeah, you mentioned it already. So we need a symplectic integrator, essentially, because we want to preserve the phase space structure around the particles, because they all obey the Liouville theorem and because they are collision with particles. So the only constraint is we want to have ideally a symplectic integrator, and what we typically use is for many of these simulations, is a second order leapfrog integrator. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how feasible this would be if super, but I can imagine that for larger regions, the time evolution is significantly slower than others. Some is more complicated too. I can imagine where we have larger time step in some areas than others. I don't know if that's a thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, actually, talking about the method could be a full week only talking about method, and that's another important thing beyond the integrator. So it's true that if you have, for example, dark matter particles in a void, then the dynamical timescale there is just typically much longer than what you have at the center of a halo. So the question then is, do you want to evolve all the particles on the same time step, which is problematic because then you evolve a lot of particles on the small time steps which they actually would not require. Because in a void, not much is happening to the particles. They will just move along, and you can just drift them without calculating constantly their forces. So the question is, how do you incorporate this? And what we typically do for all these simulations is we have kind of adaptive time stepping. So every particle has its own time step in the simulation, because the dynamic range and also the range in time steps is just too large. Otherwise, if you run this with a constant time step, the number of time steps is too large and the number of force calculations is too large. Then the whole thing becomes, again, very slow. So we have, and many other simulation codes have this as well, we essentially have a scheme where we have a certain timeline, and we divide this by factors of 2, and then we put the particles on certain time bins depending on their local dynamical time scale. So every particle has its own assigned time step in that sense. Yeah. And then with this time step, it's then evolved by calculating the forces like that with a leapfrog algorithm, which is symplectic, which is important for the problem. And that gives you the full solution. So these are essentially the key ingredients: the force with 3pm, the time integration with a symplectic leapfrog, and the adaptive time steps. Yep.
How many years or gauge years, omega years, whatever is the standard, the typical time step?
This depends strongly on the simulation. So if you have, for example, if you have simulations of the first stars or so with very high resolution, then the simulation time can actually be slower than the work log time of the simulation, meaning that you run the simulation for 2 days and it advanced less than 2 days in time. In real.
What I mean is for the particle, like at this time I, and at the time I plus 1, that length of time.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, so let's not talk about these first star simulations because they are very extreme. But for these standard simulations, the typical time set is of the order of 100,000 years or a million years for the smallest time step. These large scale simulations, of course. It depends a lot. If you have hydrodynamics included, it can be shorter. If you have dark matter only, it's typically of that order. It just depends a lot on the physics because, for the dark matter only system, the time step is mainly regulated by the acceleration of the particle. So if the acceleration is very large, you want to have a small time step for that particle. If it's very small, you can afford a large time step. However, if you also have hydrodynamics, so if you also follow the gas by solving the Euler equations, then a Courant condition kicks in, and that can be more stringent or is often more stringent than the actual gravitational time step. So then you have to evolve the system all on these different time steps depending on the physics you put in. Or for example, if you have black hole accretion, then the accretion onto the black hole also demands a certain time step. Or all these processes. But it's typically, it's 100,000 years or so, or 10,000 years.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because in these megaparsec scales thing, right, like there's a clustering happening here.
Yes.
This particle over here is not going to feel the gravitation. Enough time has passed, but your time steps are long enough. That
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to have these adaptive time steps so that the particles at the centers of halos are evolved on these short time steps where you keep the others, where you don't update the forces of the other particles because their forces are not significantly affected over that time scale. Any other questions? Yeah.
So it's all parallelized?
Yeah, I come to that in a. Yeah, I come to that in a second. It's all parallelized. Yeah.
This is all classical
Yep. Yes, it is. Yep. This is the nice thing about these dark matter only simulations. It's a pure n-body problem at the end of the day. There's not much more going in. As long as you do CDM, if you want to do self-indecting dark matter or other dark matter forms, you have to put a bit more in. That I will discuss this probably tomorrow. But for pure CDM, that's all what you have to do. You have your initial conditions, and you have the n-body problem. You solve it, and then you just go for it. Yeah. The only challenge is to put a large n onto the machine, because you want to have a large number of particles. That's the challenge. Yeah. Okay, good. So now, I cannot talk too much about parallelization, and I'm also not the greatest expert in that. But of course, we have to parallelize all these problems. That means we have to divide the work among various processors. So you cannot. We said already before, we cannot fit all the data on a single processor, and also if we would be able to do it, it would just be extremely slow. So even with all these tricks, it's still a lot of computing power. And many of these simulations, especially the hydro simulations, they need of the order of 20, 30, 50, or even 100 million CPU hours. So you really need to do this in parallel. And there are various ways to do this. And at the most basic level, essentially you distribute your particles according to two criteria. One is the workload, and one is the memory load, essentially. So you want to make sure that if you have 10,000 cores, that all of them have to do roughly the same work and roughly have the same memory load. Because if this becomes very imbalanced, and this gets worse for larger core numbers, if it becomes a bit imbalanced, then your whole calculation is just dependent on one little core that is not fast enough to keep up with its work that it's assigned to it. So you want to make sure that this is as well distributed as possible. And one way to distribute this, and I can really only scratch the surface here, but is you take essentially, you assign every particle in your simulation domain to something which is called a Peano-Hilbert curve. So that's a space-filling curve. So this is shown here in 2D and here in 3D. And the nice thing about this curve is that if particles are close along this one-dimensional mapping, they are close in 1D, but they are also close in 3D. That's just this fractal structure here. Yeah? So if you have, for example, particles, if you walk this curve here, you can see by eye, if you have particles here, they are just also spatially nearby, and this goes on if you make this finer and finer. So what we essentially do is we assign the particles to this curve, and then we chop the curve such that the workload per let me rephrase this. We chop the curve in little pieces and assign these pieces to the different processors. And the pieces are cut in such a way that the workload and the memory load per processor for that piece of the curve is roughly constant across all the cores. Really the only thing you want to achieve is a good load balancing for the work and for the memory load. That's the only thing you want to achieve for parallelization, right? So that is the main thing, because if you don't get this right, then the whole simulation will be just very inefficient. Yeah, you do this frequently not every time step, but you do it from time to time as the simulation evolves, because the particles move around. Yeah. And the nice thing here is also that the tree is kind of, it nicely maps to this Peano-Hilbert curve. Essentially what we have in the simulation, we have this a global, this is shown in 2 dimensions, it's a quad tree, but usually it's an oct tree. We have this fiducial global tree, and then we assign, based on this tree, we assign, as shown here by the different colors, we assign different particle sets which are just in these parts of this global tree, which are again pieces of the Peano-Hilbert curve. We assign this to different processors such that the workload and the memory load is balanced. Of course, the main challenge here is to write down a good function to measure the workload and the memory load because that tells you how you distribute, and you want to do this as good as possible so that this is really kind of even among the different processors. So there's a lot of tricks how to do this, and this is really just the most basic scheme. So it's a huge challenge to parallelize this efficiently, and there are also not many people around who can actually do this very efficiently, because if you think about, for example, to parallelize a simulation over 30 or 40,000 cores, it's very difficult to keep all the processors busy at the same level all the time. Because if one processor has 10% more to do than the others, it's already over. Then it becomes very inefficient. So you really want to distribute this evenly. And the problem is, of course, also that the whole problem, because of the clustering, by nature becomes very unbalanced if you don't do anything about it. Because the gravity pulls together all these particles in these huge objects, so the system or the physics drives it into a state where it's intrinsically difficult to balance. Yeah, which makes it, again, more difficult to do all this. And so there's a huge literature how to do this, and computer scientists and many other people have worked on that. It's typically not so trivial to parallelize that. And by the way, also the code that we are going to use on Friday is essentially using that scheme. So we will, if you have an MPI installed, which is this parallel communication library, which passes messages from one task or from one processor to the other, and if you have a 4-core machine or an 8-core machine here in your laptop, then it will use all the cores equally, and you can then make a test. You can, for example, run the example that we have, or that I give you on Friday, on 2 cores and on 4 cores, and you will see it speeds up significantly if you run it on 4 cores. This is a typical strong scaling test. So you increase the number of processors for the same problem size, and it just gets faster. And ideal strong scaling would be if you increase the number of processors by 2 for the same problem size, the code should get faster by a factor of 2. Yeah. So there's a lot of, if you write computing time proposals, they always want to see 2 things. Mostly weak scaling, which means that you scale also the problem size up with your compute core count, and sometimes also strong scaling. So you can try this all on Friday also yourself to see how the code actually scales. Yeah. Okay, so that's all that I want to say about standard embodied methods, and now I want to spend maybe another 10 minutes or 15 minutes on these techniques that I have been working on during my PhD actually, which go beyond standard embodied methods. And the first question that you might ask is, why do you actually want to go beyond these standard embodied methods? I mean, I just talked a lot about how great this all is and how efficient, but the problem is, even these very large simulations that I mentioned before, like this Aquarius simulation, we had an effective force softening of the order of 30 or 50 parsec. Now, if you think about direct detection experiments, it matters here, the dark matter distribution matters on much smaller scales than just 50 parsec. So we want to know this on much smaller scales. And I also showed you this phase-based distribution of dark matter with these caustics and the streams. And all these embodied methods, even for the largest number of n, they cannot resolve these streams and these caustics currently because they happen on too small scales. So the question is, can we come up with something that can also resolve this fine-grained structure? Can resolve these caustics and can also resolve the streams, with the basic idea that we want to make more detailed predictions for detection experiments, both indirect and direct, because standard embodied methods cannot resolve them. Yeah, this makes sense to everybody why we want to do this. So the resolution of these standard methods, even if you increase the n dramatically, you cannot increase, at least currently, you cannot increase the n so much to really resolve the fine-grained structure. But the fine-grained structure can have implications for the detection experiments. So this is why you want to go beyond these embodied methods to come up with something new. So this is again the same picture I showed you before. And just to remind you, there was this caustic here and this multi-stream region here, and all of this can have implications for the detection. So this was here this ADMX example, for example, or any axion detection, where you have these multiple streams. For indirect detection, you could have this annihilation boost because of the caustics. And the question is, how can we study this? And it's just not possible with standard embodied methods because we cannot sample the phase space sheet good enough with the current number of particles that we can put onto machines. So this is why a long time ago, really a long time ago, my supervisor and I came up with a new scheme to do this, and the idea here is that in addition to your simulation particle, you track another equation, not only the force equation, but the so-called geodesic deviation equation. which tells you how an infinitesimal phase space volume would be deformed as the particle moves through the simulation volume. And so you have your simulation particle, which sits here at the center, and it moves over time to this location, and this is what the standard n-body methods would trace. It would just trace, it would see the particle here, and then at a later instant it would see the particle here. And then what we then did, we added some additional information that we could also trace the volume evolution in phase space of this phase space, this piece of phase space here, how that would evolve. Yeah, and for that, essentially you have to solve another equation, which involves this distortion tensor here. And with this equation, then if you couple this to your n-body methods, you can then resolve the fine-grained structure. So the details are described in this paper, so it's not terribly important that you understand the details, but the basic idea is that you supplement every simulation particle, every particle in the simulation with this kind of virtual cloud, and you follow the phase space deformation of this virtual cloud. And that gives you direct information about the phase space very nearby the particle, and it allows you to detect these fine-grained streams, and it also allows you to detect these caustics. And then you can make predictions for the fine-grained structure and see how much this would actually impact any detection experiment. Yeah. So if you do this, you can, for example, look at the Milky Way halo. This is similar to the halo I showed yesterday from the Zig-Various simulation. And you can take all your simulation particles from the n-body method, and you can color code them in phase space, now in a one-dimensional phase space, according to the number of caustics they went through. Yeah, so the particles will fall into the halo, and they will undergo these caustics, and the color here encodes the number of caustics. And what you see here, if you look at the upper picture, so this is just showing as a function of radius and velocity, just projecting the 6D phase space into a 2D phase space, showing you the distribution here. You see these high color, or these yellow regions. These are just subhalos where the particles had a lot of time, so the dynamic timescale is rather short at these centers, so they underwent a lot of caustics. So they clearly stand out here, and you can also see at the center you get this kind of yellow color, because also the timescales, they are very short, so they underwent a lot of caustics. You can then also remove the subhalos and just look at this main halo, and you can also nicely see these kind of stream-like features. And all this you cannot resolve at that level of detail with a standard n-body method. Yeah? So because you have no handle on this caustic count and the fine-grained streams and any of that. This is only possible if you couple this to this additional method. And here's a zoom in. So you see this more clearly. These are just individual subhalos. And I think this is just zoomed in even further. I think the aspect ratio is slightly different, which is why the shapes look slightly different. But you get the idea. It's just, it's essentially the winding up of phase space that you see here, because the caustic count increases. Yeah. You can then also look at the cosmic web around these halos and filter the web by the caustic count. And if you remember from this, let me just go back, from this picture here, you can see that the particles that are outside of the halo, yeah, so this is the halo again, particles outside of the halo are still in this Hubble flow regime, so they didn't undergo any caustic yet, because they didn't collapse onto a halo. So their caustic count should actually be 0, because they only increase their caustic count if they fall into a halo. So what we would expect actually is that far away from the halo, we would see kind of these 0 caustic particles. And in fact, if you look at the distribution here and filter only for particles which have 0 caustics, you get this kind of, well, pretty uniform distribution of all the particles that didn't go into a sheet or anything of the cosmic web or the halo yet. And then you keep increasing the caustic count, and for larger and larger caustic counts, you go more towards the smaller scales, essentially, because the dynamical timescales are shorter there. You can also then make radial profiles, for example here. So this is as a function of radius in units of R200, the typical number of caustic counts. This is just the median here for different numerical resolutions. And you can see that this is kind of the predicted profile that we get. Let's see. Yeah, and this is another way of showing that in different radii, the caustic count distribution, how many caustics you have at a given radius. And again, if you're in the inner part, you get this tail here towards very large caustic counts, again, because of the short dynamical timescales. And then what's more interesting than the caustic count is actually the stream density that we expect. And these are literally these fine-grained streams that I mentioned before. Yeah, so this is the density sorry that I keep going back, but this is the density of such a stream. So what's the average density or the median density of such a stream? Again, if that density would be very large, we would probably detect this with ADMX. If it's very low, we would not detect it. Because then you would have a lot of streams and you would not, the energy resolution would not be sufficient to detect that. So you can actually look at the average stream density in terms of the background density, and you see it's slightly below the background density. And that gives you already an idea what the expected number of streams near the solar position is, because we said yesterday that the delta, so the dark matter overdensity at the center of the Milky Way halo or so, or at the solar position is of the order of 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 7. So if these streams are already below the average density, then we would expect millions or tens of millions or even more streams at the position of the Earth, which is too much for ADMX essentially to disentangle them. So it's then very unlikely that you would see a very strong stream there in the detector. And you can also then calculate the number of streams doing various estimates. So this is if you take the median, which focuses essentially more on the more massive streams. So you get of the order of 10 to the 6 massive streams. Now if you take here the harmonic mean, count more all the streams, you get of the order of 10 to the 15. There's a lot of low mass streams also in the system. So it's just in, however you count this, it's just such a large number that it's very unlikely that ADMX will be able to disentangle that. Mm-hmm.
Is that the density of any individual stream?
Yes.
Okay, and so when you say it's less in the background, you mean that the amount, is it like a negative density, or is it just like the amount for which it is greater than the background is less than the overall background?
No, what I mean is that if you take an individual stream, the average density is less than the background, so to make up the total density of the halo, you have to add up a lot of these streams, essentially. So you have to get the right density, we discussed yesterday these density profiles, these NFW profiles. So to get the right NFW density, you have to add up millions or tens of millions of these streams, essentially. Which says that the number is very large of the streams. Okay. This is also shown here. This is just showing you the probability of finding very dense streams. So this is just the stream density compared to the average density in the halo. And you can see that it's very unlikely to find these very dense streams here. Essentially, this is just a cumulative plot here of the order of 10 to the minus 5 or so, or less than 10 to the minus 4. It's really a very, very low probability of finding very dense streams here locally at the solar position. Okay. Another thing you can do, and I'm nearly done for today, is you can also filter all the particles in high and low stream density and follow the time evolution. So this is starting at pretty early times at redshift 18 or 19, and then goes to redshift 0, and you can see that these two populations, these blue and red particles, and the red are particles which have a very low stream density today, and you can see that their distinguishing feature compared to the blue particles is that they already clustered at very early times. And the reason is, again, they cluster at very early times, and then the particles orbit a lot in these halos, and the phase space sheet just gets stretched and stretched further. It cannot tear because of the Liouville theorem, but it just gets lower and lower density. So the real space density. So this is why also at late times, then these are the lowest density particles, because at early times they clustered already. It's different for the blue particles because they did not cluster so much, so they have the highest density at late times. And directly related to that is then also the caustic count. So if you filter by high and low caustic count, if you take, for example, the high caustic count particles, which are shown here as red, they also cluster already at early times. And you can, and the blue ones, which have the low caustic count, they cluster much later. Yeah. Again, this is this dynamical timescale argument. Okay. Excuse me. And then the last thing, or nearly the last thing that I want to show, is then, of course, if you have these caustics and all this stuff in the simulation, you want to ask, how much does this really affect then detection experiments? So the caustics, as I mentioned before, can increase the gamma ray annihilation. However, they can only do this if they really contribute significantly to the overall emission that you get from the smooth component of the halo that is resolved also in standard and body simulations. And this shows you the ratio of the caustic contribution essentially by the smooth component. So the smooth you can also translate in what standard and body simulations resolve. And you can see that in the inner part this is typically negligible. It's much below 0.1% or so. In the outer part you can get off the order of 10%, but it's never an enormous effect. So it's not that these caustics double or increase your annihilation signal by a factor of 10. The reason for that is that the dynamic timescales are typically so short that the densities strongly go down because of the stretching of the phase space sheet, essentially. Yeah? So it means that caustics most likely do not contribute significantly to the annihilation signal. Okay, and this is just a last plot, I think, showing you the variation from halo to halo. So this is showing now the caustic count for different halos, how it varies. So these are just different Milky Way-like halos, and you can see this is pretty, it doesn't vary too much. So there's not too much object-to-object variation, which means that all the results that I mentioned before should be rather stable, despite the fact that they were based on just a single halo. Okay, and I stop here. Thanks.